Hello everyone. A friend showed me a video that really left me thinking, and now I will like to share something similar with you. Imagine a child who started to steal at an early age from others' pens, monies, small change, it doesn't matter. Without being corrected by anyone from an early age, this child will grow up believing he is right. That's what happens if we see these things and keep quiet. So as the story of Paul, corruption doesn't start with grand schemes. It begins with small compromises. Paul learned this the hard way when he found himself trapped in a web of lies, deception, and greed. We can agree that bribery and corruption are among the most sinister threats not only to the integrity of companies but also to the economic stability of nations. To design effective prevention and mitigation strategies, it is crucial to understand their fundamental concepts, legal frameworks, and the profound societal impacts they inflict. Allow me to share a story that captures the dark essence of corruption. Paul was a sharp and ambitious businessman whose every venture turned into a success story, albeit through means that many would consider deeply unethical. His methods were simple. Whenever an opportunity arose, Paul was ready to offer, give, or receive something of value, a discreet favor, an unexpected gift, or even a well-timed promise, in exchange for influencing key decisions in his favor. Paul's reputation was built on a series of calculated moves. He didn't hesitate to engage in all forms of corrupt practices, bribery, fraud, embezzlement, and blatant abuse of power. Hosting lavish parties was his way of smoothing over any potential obstacles. At these gatherings, select guests received generous gifts, and by the next morning, they'd receive a call from Paul asking for a favor. His mantra was simple and unapologetic: "You scratch my back, I scratch yours. We're like brothers, after all, I'm my brother's keeper." Paul was streetwise, smart, and he knew all the tricks in the book. Paul's corrupt network was vast and multifaceted, employing various types of bribery to secure his objectives. Active bribery. Paul was often the one initiating the exchange, offering valuable incentives to those in power. Passive bribery. In other cases, he accepted bribes, ensuring that his ventures benefited from favors in return. Facilitation payments. Small, under-the-table payments smoothed the way for minor, yet critical, administrative processes. Extortion. There were even times when Paul used his influence to coerce others into providing benefits that they would otherwise not consider. Manifestations of corruption in the workplace. Bribery and procurement. In one of his more notorious schemes, Paul would target companies and governmental bodies responsible for awarding contracts. By selectively choosing friends who held influential positions, he ensured that tenders were always directed his way, bypassing fair competition entirely. Paul knew how to choose friends, and everywhere his siblings worked, he would get tenders. Conflicts of interest. It wasn't unusual for Paul to create scenarios where personal interests clouded professional judgment. For instance, managers under his influence would award contracts to friends or family members, completely sidelining the best interests of the company. Paul's knack for this was legendary. Every contract he desired seemed to fall right into his lap. Embezzlement. Another dark facet of Paul's operations was his weakness for misappropriating funds. Instead of investing company money in proper materials or development, he funneled resources into schemes that enriched himself and his cronies. When questioned, the usual explanation was that it was all in the name of business efficiency, a claim no one in his orbit dared to challenge. Abuse of power. Paul's leadership style was autocratic. He wielded his influence ruthlessly, often using company resources for his personal benefits and pushing for unwarranted favors from those who served under him. His slogan, echoing through the halls of every business meeting he attended, was as clear as it was corrupt: "If you helped me today, you'd be owed tomorrow." Understanding these forms of bribery and corruption is crucial. I thought to myself, it is a necessary step towards creating environments of integrity and transparency. By exposing the tactics used by individuals like Paul, organizations can begin to implement safeguards that protect their interests and the interests of the broader community. This story allows us to remember some of the things we saw happening right in front of us and to start thinking how to expose them and to come up with strategies to combat these pervasive issues. Stay tuned as we unravel more layers of corruption and its impact on our society. Thank you for joining me as corruption affects all of us, and together, we can understand these patterns and ultimately overcoming corruption in all its forms. The cost of Paul's corruption. For years, Paul operated like a king in the shadows, pulling strings, making deals, and ensuring his empire thrived, by any means necessary. He thought he was untouchable. But corruption, like a ticking time bomb, never stays hidden forever. Reputational damage word travels fast, and in the business world, reputations are everything. As rumors spread about Paul's underhanded tactics, rigged contracts, suspicious deals, and extravagant gifts, his once loyal clients started pulling away. Investors hesitated. No one wanted to be associated with a man whose success was built on deception. One morning, he received an email from an international company he had been negotiating with for months. They were withdrawing their offer, citing concerns regarding ethical business practices. Paul clenched his fists. The same shady deals that made him powerful were now closing doors in his face. Loss of investor confidence. The decline wasn't just talk. Investors who once flocked to Paul's businesses like moths to a flame were now distancing themselves. Some had lost money, others feared being implicated in legal trouble. His empire, built on fragile foundations, started to show cracks. A longtime business associate told him, "Paul, no one wants to invest in a sinking ship. Clean up your act, or you'll go down with it." But Paul refused to change. He still believed he could talk or bribe his way out of anything. Legal consequences. Then came the day he never thought would come. Authorities knocked on his office door. A whistleblower had exposed his network of bribery and fraud. Investigators uncovered rigged tenders, missing funds, and payments that couldn't be explained. Paul's assets were frozen. Lawsuits piled up. His once loyal friends and business partners suddenly disappeared, pretending they had never known him. Legal battles drained his finances, and for the first time, Paul was truly powerless. Competitive disadvantage. Meanwhile, honest businesses, ones he had once crushed with unfair advantages, were thriving. Without bribery tipping the scales, real competition returned. Companies won contracts based on merit, not influence. Paul watched helplessly as former rivals took over markets he once dominated. His name was now synonymous with corruption. Even those who admired his success once upon a time now avoided him like a plague. Erosion of corporate culture. Paul's businesses had never operated on integrity, but now, without his influence, the true depth of the damage was exposed. Employees, once loyal out of fear, started leaving. The ones who stayed were either demotivated or looking for their own way to exploit the system. Without trust, leadership, or direction, Paul's company crumbled from the inside. The effects on society. Paul's corruption didn't just destroy his business, it had rippled into the community. Economic distortions. His fraudulent deals had drained resources that could have fueled honest businesses. Local entrepreneurs struggled because funds meant for them had been funneled into Paul's personal empire. Undermined rule of law. His unchecked corruption had sent a message: the system could be bought. Trust in law enforcement weakened, and people began believing that money, not justice, decided fate. Social inequalities. While Paul and his circle lived lavishly, communities suffered. Schools lacked proper funding. Roads remained unfixed. Hospitals operated without essential supplies, all because money meant for public welfare had been siphoned off through corrupt contracts. Impeded service delivery. Corruption in public services led to inefficiencies. The substandard materials Paul provided in his projects began to fail. Bridges cracked, roads deteriorated, and public buildings remained unfinished. Lives were affected, but Paul had never cared, until now, when the consequences were his own to bear. Damage to democratic processes. His bribery had extended to politics, ensuring that those in power served their own interests instead of the people. Now, as his influence waned, the public began questioning the system. The fall. Paul sat in his once grand office, now stripped of its luxury. The deals, the favors, the power, it was all gone. He had spent his life building an empire, only to watch it collapse under the weight of corruption. For years, he had believed that the rules didn't apply to him. But in the end, corruption is a game that never truly benefits anyone, not the individuals, not the businesses, and certainly not society. Paul had destroyed himself. And for the first time in his life, there was no one left to bail him out. Paul has destroyed himself and a lot of things as well. There is a lot now that needs to be adjusted, laws to be revisited and put in place so that such things do not reoccur. He sat on a chair and read from one of his journals which was gathering dust on the shelves. Why do most organizations fail? Paul sat restlessly on the chair. How is Paul going to bail himself out? Remember that child who stole pens, small change from others? Do we keep him quiet? Do we correct him? Or as long as he is not your child? As for Paul, we now know why his business and others fail. What do we do now?